Gate 32, fluorescent lights, a carry-on that knows the route by heart. Sarah Mitchell checks the departures board, armored in the life she built, when a voice she hasn't heard in 6 years cuts through the intercom hum. In the next 60 seconds, a chance encounter will rip open the tidy story of her past and force the choice no boardroom ever taught her to make: the empire she created or the family she lost. What begins between final boarding and doors closing will redefine love, sacrifice, and second chances. The polished marble floors of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as Sarah Mitchell's Louboutin heels clicked with military precision toward Gate B12. Her tailored Armani suit, the color of midnight, commanded respect from every passerby who instinctively stepped aside. The weight of her Hermes briefcase felt familiar in her manicured grip, a comfort she'd learned to embrace in the 6 years since her world had imploded. Sarah paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, her reflection ghosting over the Boeing 747 being prepped for her flight to New York. At 38, she possessed the kind of devastating beauty that came not from genetics alone but from survival. Her emerald eyes, once warm with laughter, now held the calculated coolness of a woman who'd learned that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The platinum wedding band she'd worn for 8 years had been replaced by a diamond so massive it caught light like a weapon. "Ms. Mitchell," her assistant's voice crackled through her Bluetooth earpiece, "the Nakamura deal just closed. Congratulations, you're now worth $2.8 billion. Sarah's lips curved in what others might mistake for a smile, but her eyes remained fixed on her reflection. "Transfer the celebration bonus to the team. I want everyone to know their work matters." "Already done, ma'am. Also, there's been another inquiry from that documentary crew. Something about women who changed everything. Should I—" "No interviews, you know my policy." Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who'd built an empire from the ashes of her former life. "I have a plane to catch." She disconnected the call and allowed herself one moment of genuine emotion: exhaustion. 6 years of 18-hour days, of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, of proving over and over again that Sarah Mitchell was more than just another bitter divorcee who'd gotten lucky in the settlement. She'd taken her half of what they'd built together and multiplied it tenfold, becoming the youngest woman ever to crack Forbes's top 10. But success, she'd learned, was a cold bedfellow. The gate area buzzed with the usual airport chaos: businessmen shouting into phones, families corralling children, the eternal dance of departure and arrival. Sarah found her usual spot in the first-class lounge, a corner table, where she could observe without being observed. Old habits died hard, and the hypervigilance that had saved her company from 3 hostile takeovers served her well in all aspects of life. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the Nakamura contracts, but something made her look up. Call it intuition, call it the universe's cruel sense of timing. But her eyes were drawn to Gate B8, just across the concourse. The breath left her lungs in a rush that made her dizzy. There, crouched, beside 2 small suitcases decorated with unicorn stickers, was Marcus. Her Marcus. The man she'd loved since college, married at 24, and divorced 6 years ago in proceedings that had made Entertainment Tonight for 3 consecutive weeks. His dark hair was shorter now, threaded with silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than older. He wore the same kind of casual button-down and khakis combination that had once driven her crazy with how effortlessly handsome he looked. But it wasn't Marcus who made her heart stop. It was the 2 little girls standing beside him, Emma and Sophie, her daughters, her babies, who'd been barely 2 years old when the custody battle had ripped them from her arms. Now they were 8, and the resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable. The same wild curls she'd spent her childhood trying to tame, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. Emma, she could tell, because Emma had always been the more cautious twin, clutched a worn stuffed elephant that Sarah recognized with a jolt of pure pain. Mr. Peanuts, the toy she'd bought during her 2nd trimester, the one she'd slept with during those final weeks of her high-risk pregnancy. Sophie bounced on her toes beside her sister, animated and excited, gesturing wildly as she told Marcus some story that made him throw back his head and laugh. The sound of his laughter, once the soundtrack to her happiest memories, hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. 6 years. 6 years of pretending she didn't wake up every morning, wondering if today would be the day Marcus would call, would bring the girls to see her, would find a way to bridge the impossible chasm that the divorce had carved between them. 6 years of telling herself she was better off without them. 6 years of lying to herself with every breath. A flight. Attendant's voice echoed over the intercom. Flight 447 to Denver, now boarding at gate B8. Denver. They were going to Denver. Why Denver? Marcus had always hated Colorado. Too cold, he'd said. Too isolated. Unless... Sarah's mind, trained to process complex financial scenarios in seconds, began cataloging possibilities. Marcus's brother lived in Denver. His brother who'd testified against her during the custody hearing, who'd painted her as an unstable workaholic who'd chosen her. Career over her children. His brother who'd offered Marcus a job at his accounting firm when the court had frozen their shared assets. "Ma'am?" A server appeared at her elbow. "Can I get you anything? You look a little pale." Sarah blinked, realizing she'd been staring across the concourse for who knows how long. Other passengers were probably starting to notice. She was recognizable now. Not Hollywood famous, but business world famous, which in Seattle carried its own weight. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "Just, reviewing some contracts." The server nodded and moved away, but Sarah could feel his concern lingering. She forced herself to look down at her laptop screen, but the words blurred together. All she could see was Sophie's animated face as she tugged on Marcus's sleeve, pointing at something that had caught her attention. Had she grown taller? Sophie had always been the smaller twin, born 3 minutes after. Emma and determined to make up for lost time ever since. Did she still hate vegetables? Did Emma still have nightmares about monsters under the bed? Did either of them remember the woman who'd sung them to sleep every night for the first 2 years of their lives? Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The Nakamura team, probably wanting to discuss implementation timelines. The rational part of her brain, the part that had built Mitchell Industries into a global powerhouse, told her to answer, to conduct business as usual, to pretend she hadn't just been sucker-punched by the past. Instead, she declined the call and found herself standing, moving toward the wide windows that separated the gate areas. Marcus was helping Emma with her backpack, his movements patient and practiced in a way that spoke of 6 years of single parenthood. The sight filled Sarah with an emotion she couldn't name, part pride that he'd stepped up, part grief for all the moments she'd missed, part something that felt dangerously like longing. Sophie had wandered a few steps away, her attention caught by a service dog wearing a bright red vest. Sarah watched as her younger daughter approached the dog's handler, an elderly man with kind eyes, and began what appeared to be an earnest conversation about the animal's training. Classic Sophie, Sarah thought with a smile that felt rusty on her face. Fearless, curious, assuming the best of everyone she met. Just like Sarah had been once upon a time. "Sophie, stay where I can see you," Marcus called, and Sarah's heart clenched at the gentle authority in his voice. He'd grown into fatherhood, she realized. The man she'd married had been loving but uncertain, always deferring to her maternal instincts. This version of Marcus moved with confidence, secure in his role as their protector and guide. The boarding announcement came again, more urgent this time. Marcus began gathering their belongings, and Sarah realized with growing panic that she had perhaps 5 minutes before they disappeared into the jet bridge and out of her life again. 5 minutes to decide whether to reveal herself or remain hidden. 5 minutes to choose between the safety of anonymity and the terrifying possibility of what? What did she think would happen if she approached them? That Marcus would welcome her with open arms? That the girls would remember her, would forgive her for 6 years of absence? Her rational mind, the one that had negotiated billion-dollar deals, presented the likely scenarios. Marcus would be polite but cold. The girls would be confused, possibly upset. Other passengers would start recording with their phones. By tomorrow, the story would be trending on social media. Billionaire mom stalks ex-family at airport. But as she watched Sophie return to Marcus's side, chattering excitedly about the service dog, Sarah found herself remembering a different scenario. A different airport, actually. San Francisco, 8 years ago. She'd been 6 months pregnant with the twins, huge and uncomfortable and terrified about the complications her doctor had warned about. Marcus had been speaking at a conference, and she'd flown down to surprise him. She'd waited at his gate with balloons and his favorite coffee, excited to tell him that the latest ultrasound had shown both babies were healthy, that the crisis had passed. When he'd emerged from the jet bridge and spotted her, his face had lit up like Christmas morning. He'd dropped his briefcase, not caring as papers scattered, and lifted her off her feet in a spin that had made her laugh until tears streamed down her face. "My girls," he'd whispered against her hair, his hands splayed protectively over her belly. "My beautiful girls." The memory hit her with such force that she had to steady herself against the window. When had they stopped being his girls? When had the fairy tale? Marriage crumbled into lawyers and depositions and custody evaluations. She knew the answer, of course. She'd always known, even when she'd been too proud to admit it. The answer was standing 30 feet away, helping Emma zip up her jacket while Sophie bounced impatiently beside them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Flight 447 to Denver." Sarah watched Marcus hand the gate agent their boarding passes, watched Emma carefully fold her pass and tuck it into her backpack pocket. So organized, so much like Sarah had been at that age. Watched Sophie wave goodbye to the service dog and his owner with the kind of unself-conscious joy that came from believing the world was fundamentally good. They were walking toward the jet bridge now, part of the line of passengers eager to begin their journey. In 30 seconds, they'd be gone. Sarah's feet moved before her brain could stop them. "Marcus." The word came out barely above a whisper, but in the acoustics of the gate area, it carried. Marcus stopped so suddenly that Sophie bumped into his back. He turned slowly, as if he'd heard a ghost calling his name. Their eyes met across 15 feet of airport carpet, and Sarah watched 6 years of careful composure crumble from his face. His mouth opened, then closed, no sound emerging. The boarding passes fluttered from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Daddy," Emma's voice, uncertain and small. "Daddy, what's wrong?" But Sophie had followed her father's gaze, and Sarah watched as recognition dawned in her daughter's eyes. Not complete recognition, she'd been too young when Sarah left, but something deeper. Some cellular memory of the woman who'd carried her for 9 months, who'd been the first voice she'd ever heard. "Mama," Sophie whispered, the word hanging in the air like a prayer. And Sarah's carefully constructed world shattered into a million pieces. The airport around them seemed to fade into white. Noise, the rumble of departing planes, the chatter of passengers, the endless announcements over the PA system. All Sarah could see was Sophie's face, open and wondering, and Emma's confusion as she looked between her father and the elegant stranger who'd made them both freeze. "Sir?" The gate agent's voice cut through the moment. "Sir, are you boarding?" Marcus blinked, seeming to remember where they were. He looked down at the boarding passes scattered at his feet, then back at Sarah. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "Girls, take your backpacks and sit down over there." His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the tremor underneath. "Just for a minute." "But Daddy, the plane..." Emma started. "Just for a minute," Marcus repeated, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Sophie grabbed Emma's hand and tugged her toward the nearby seating area, but both girls kept looking back. Sarah could see Emma whispering urgently to her sister, could see Sophie's bright eyes darting between her parents with the kind of alert intelligence that suggested she understood more than anyone realized. Marcus walked toward Sarah slowly, each step deliberate. Up close, she could see the new lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of single parenthood, but she could also see the boy she'd fallen in love with in college, the man who'd held her hand through morning sickness and midnight feedings and the terrifying joy of becoming parents. Sarah. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that she could smell his cologne, still the same one, still the scent that could make her heart race. What are you doing here? The question was simple, but loaded with 6 years of history. What was she doing here? Catching a flight to New York? Stalking her ex-family? Having the worst timing in human history? I was traveling, she said, then winced at how inadequate the word sounded. For business, I didn't know, I wasn't expecting. Marcus nodded as if her broken sentences made perfect sense. Maybe they did. Maybe he was just as rattled as she was. We're visiting my brother, he offered. Spring break. The girls have been looking forward to it for months. Spring break, of course. Sarah had lost track of school schedules years ago, along with parent-teacher conferences and soccer games and all the rhythms of family life she'd once known by heart. They're beautiful, she said, the words scraping her throat raw. They've grown so much. They're good kids. Marcus's voice carried a note of pride that made Sarah's chest tight. Emma's reading at a 6th grade level. Sophie scored her first soccer goal last week. Soccer. Sarah remembered signing them up for Tiny Tot soccer when they were barely walking, remembered Marcus joking that they'd probably eat the grass instead of kicking the ball. The fact that Sophie was now scoring goals felt like a miracle and a tragedy all at once. Marcus, she started, but the gate agent's voice interrupted. Final boarding call for Flight 447 to Denver. All passengers must board immediately. The moment fractured. Marcus looked toward the girls, then back at Sarah, and she could see the war playing out on his face. Duty to his daughters versus what? Curiosity. Old feelings that he'd thought were safely buried. I have to go, he said, but he didn't move. No. Sarah's voice was steady now, drawing on reserves of strength she'd built through years of impossible business decisions. I know you do, but Sophie was standing up, tugging on Emma's arm. Both girls were walking back toward them, and Sarah could see the questions building in their eyes. Emma hung back, clearly unsure, but Sophie approached with the fearless directness that was her trademark. Are you really our mama? Sophie asked, tilting her head in that heartbreakingly familiar way. Daddy has pictures, but you look different. Pictures. Marcus had kept pictures. Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest. Sarah glanced at Marcus, looking for guidance, for permission, for any clue about how to navigate this minefield, but his face was unreadable. Emma stepped forward, her voice smaller than her sister's, but no less direct. Why did you go away? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. How did you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes love wasn't enough? That sometimes parents made mistakes so huge, so unforgivable, that they spent years trying to find their way back to the people they used to be? Sir, I'm sorry, but I need to close the aircraft door, the gate agent called out, her patience clearly at an end. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and Sarah could see him making the choice. Responsibility winning out over whatever complicated emotions her presence had stirred up. I'm sorry, he said, to the gate agent. We're coming. He turned to the girls. Get your backpacks, sweetheart, we really have to go now. But Sophie wasn't done. She looked up at Sarah with those fearless eyes and asked, Will you still be here when we come back? The simple question contained multitudes. Will you disappear again? Will you choose something else over us? Will you break our hearts twice? Sarah knelt down, bringing herself to Sophie's eye level. This close, she could see the freckles. Across her daughter's nose could smell the strawberry shampoo in her hair. Emma hung back more cautious, but she was listening intently. I don't know, sweetheart, Sarah said, and the honesty tasted like tears. But I hope we can figure it out. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this answer satisfied some internal logic. She looked at Emma, some silent communication passing between them, then back at Sarah. I think you should try, Sophie said simply. Trying is important. From the mouths of babes. Marcus scooped up the scattered boarding passes, his movements sharp with stress and hurry. Girls, seriously, we have to go right now or we'll miss the plane. Emma finally spoke, her voice careful and older than her years. Will you give Daddy your phone number so we can, maybe... She trailed off, but Sarah understood. Smart girl, practical girl. Emma was trying to build a bridge, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to cross it yet. Sarah looked at Marcus. Would you be okay with that? For a moment, she saw the man she'd married flicker across his face, the one who'd believed in second chances, who'd argued that any problem could be solved if both people wanted to solve it badly enough. But then his expression shuttered, and she saw the father who'd spent 6 years protecting his daughters from disappointment. We can talk, he said finally, after we get back. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was the kind of careful non-commitment that lawyers lived for and hearts broke against. Sarah pulled a business card from her purse, embossed cardstock with the Mitchell Industries logo, and handed it to Marcus. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and she felt the familiar electricity that had never quite faded. "My personal number's on the back," she said softly. "In case, if you want to." Marcus pocketed the card without looking at it. "Girls, grab your stuff. Now." The boarding process was swift and brutal. Sophie hugged Sarah's legs before anyone could stop her, a quick, fierce embrace that smelled like childhood and possibility. Emma hung back, but offered a small wave that felt like a gift. Marcus paused at the jet bridge entrance, looking back at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. For a moment, she thought he might say something, might acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened, might give her some clue about what came next. Instead, he just nodded once, sharp and formal, and disappeared into the tunnel with their daughters. Sarah stood frozen as the gate area emptied around her. The boarding door sealed with a definitive thunk. The jet bridge retracted. Through the windows, she could see Flight 447 pushing back from the gate, beginning its journey to Denver and away from her. Her phone buzzed insistently. The New York meeting, her own flight, probably boarding at a gate across the terminal. The life she'd built, demanding her attention, but Sarah couldn't move. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and watched the plane taxi toward the runway, carrying half her heart 30,000 feet into the sky. What had she done? What had they all done? "Miss Mitchell!" A voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a young man in an airport uniform looking concerned. "Are you all right? You've been standing here for quite a while." Sarah started, then stopped. What? Was she? All right? Devastated? Hopeful? Terrified? All of the above. "I'm fine," she lied, turning away from the window. Just saying goodbye. The walk back to her own gate felt endless. Her reflection in the terminal windows looked the same as it had an hour ago. Same perfect suit, same flawless makeup, same aura of untouchable success. But inside, everything had changed. The careful walls she'd built around her heart had cracks now, letting in light and pain in equal measure. Flight 227 to New York was already boarding when she arrived. Sarah took her place in the first-class line, her movements automatic. The flight attendant greeted her with professional warmth, recognizing her from previous trips. The first-class cabin wrapped around her like familiar armor, leather seats, complimentary champagne, the promise of productivity at altitude. She settled into her window seat and pulled out her laptop, but the screen remained dark. Instead, she found herself staring at Marcus's business card in her purse, the one he'd left behind 6 years ago, the one she'd never quite been able to throw away. Marcus Chen, senior partner, Chen and Associates Accounting. The Denver address was new, so he had taken his brother's job, had given up the marketing firm they'd built together, the dream they'd shared of creating something meaningful together. Another casualty of their spectacular failure at being married. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself remember what she'd spent 6 years trying to forget. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. High risk, the doctors had said, bed rest recommended. Sarah had managed 3 weeks of good behavior before the walls of their apartment had started closing in. The advertising campaign for Mitchell Industries' first major client couldn't wait for her recovery, or so she'd convinced herself. She'd started working from bed, then from the couch, then from the office. Just for important meetings. Marcus had begged her to slow down, had offered to handle everything himself while she focused on staying healthy. But Sarah had been 28 and invincible, certain she could manage everything if she just worked harder, planned better, controlled more variables. The twins had arrived 6 weeks early, tiny and fragile and perfect. Sarah had held them in the NICU and promised she'd be the mother they deserved. Present, devoted, protective. She'd kept that promise for 2 years. 2 blissful, exhausting, overwhelming years of diapers and night feedings, and the kind of bone-deep love she hadn't known was possible. Marcus had been her partner in every sense, splitting duties, sharing joys and fears, building a family that felt unshakable. Until Michael Nakamura had called. The Nakamura Group was interested in a partnership, he'd said, a chance to take Mitchell Industries global, to create something bigger than Sarah had ever dreamed. But it would require travel, to Tokyo, to Singapore, to conferences and meetings and negotiations that couldn't wait for convenient timing. Sarah had convinced herself it was temporary. 6 months, maybe a year of intense travel, and then she'd be able to give her family everything they'd ever wanted. Security, opportunity, a future without financial worry. Marcus had supported her, even when it meant single parenting while she was gone for weeks at a time. Even when she missed Emma's first steps because she was in a boardroom in Hong Kong. Even when Sophie said Daddy before Mama and Sarah had cried in a hotel bathroom in Seoul. The business had exploded. Contracts worth millions, then tens of millions, then more than Sarah had ever imagined possible. She was profiled in Forbes, invited to speak at conferences, courted by venture capitalists who saw her as the next big thing. And slowly, imperceptibly, she'd started to believe her own press. Started to think that her success was more important than bedtime stories, that providing financially was the same as being present emotionally. Marcus had tried to warn her, had pointed out how many dinners she'd missed, how many weekends she'd spent on conference calls, how the girls had started asking why Mama was always gone. But Sarah had been drunk on success, convinced that everything she was doing was for them. The end had come not with a dramatic fight, but with a quiet conversation on a Tuesday night in March. Sarah had been home for less than 48 hours between trips, and she'd spent most of that time on the phone with clients. Marcus had put the girls to bed alone, again, and found Sarah in their home office, again, laptop open and phone pressed to her ear. "I can't do this anymore," he'd said simply. Sarah had looked up from her screens, annoyed at the interruption. "Can't do what?" "Be married to someone who's never here." The words had hit her like cold water. "That's not fair, Marcus. Everything I'm doing is for this family." "No," he'd replied, and his voice had carried a finality that had made her stomach drop. "Everything you're doing is for Sarah Mitchell, CEO. When's the last time you did something for Sarah Mitchell, wife and mother?" The fight that had followed had been devastating in its scope and cruelty. 6 years of resentments had poured out like poison. Marcus accusing her of abandoning their family for her career. Sarah accusing him of trying to hold her back, of being jealous of her success, of wanting her to be nothing more than a housewife and mother. They'd said things that night that couldn't be taken back, made accusations that had cut so deep they'd left scars on both their souls. And in the morning, Marcus had taken the girls to his mother's house for a few days to cool off. Those few days had turned into separation, then custody battles, then divorce proceedings that had played out, in gossip columns and business journals with equal fervor. Sarah had fought for joint custody, convinced she could balance everything if given the chance, but the court had seen the travel schedule, the work commitments, the pattern of missed opportunities. "In the best interests of the children," the judge had said, awarding primary custody to Marcus with supervised visitation for Sarah. Supervised visitation, as if she were a danger to her own daughters. The visits had been stilted, artificial things. 2 hours in a sterile office with a court-appointed supervisor taking notes. Emma and Sophie, confused and upset by the entire situation, had gradually grown distant. Sarah had struggled to connect with them in such an unnatural environment, and the girls had begun to resist even those limited interactions. After a year of awkward, heartbreaking visits, Sarah had made the most difficult decision of her life. She told Marcus she wouldn't fight the custody arrangement anymore, wouldn't put the girls through any more legal proceedings. She'd give them space to heal, to adjust to their new normal. What she'd really done was run away. thrown herself into work with even more intensity, built her empire higher and stronger, convinced herself that success was the only love language she'd ever been fluent in. And for 6 years, it had worked. Or she'd told herself it had worked. Mitchell Industries had become a global powerhouse. Sarah had become one of the most successful women in business. She'd proven to the world and to herself that she was more than just another casualty of divorce court. But seeing Sophie's fearless smile and Emma's cautious intelligence had cracked something open in Sarah's chest that no amount of professional achievement could fill. The plane leveled off and the seatbelt light dinged off. Sarah's seatmate, a businessman absorbed in his tablet, glanced over at her with mild concern. You all right?" he asked. "You look a little pale." Sarah realized she'd been gripping the armrests hard enough to leave indentations in the leather. She forced herself to relax, to smile with practiced composure. "Fine," she said, "just thinking about a meeting." It wasn't entirely a lie. She was thinking about a meeting, one that might never happen, with 2 little girls who might never forgive her and an ex-husband who had every right to protect them from further disappointment. Sarah pulled out her phone and stared at Marcus's business card for a long moment. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she opened her contacts and carefully entered his information. She didn't call, not yet, but having his number in her phone felt like a first step towards something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or redemption, or just the simple, terrifying possibility that some mistakes weren't permanent. The flight to New York passed in a blur of turbulence and tortured thoughts. Sarah tried to focus on the Nakamura implementation strategy, but her mind kept wandering to Denver. Were Marcus and the girls on the ground yet? Had Sophie told her uncle about meeting Mama at the airport? Did Emma remember any of the lullabies Sarah used to sing? By the time they landed at JFK, Sarah had made a decision that would have shocked her board of directors and probably given her lawyers heart attacks. She was going to cancel the New York meetings. She was going to Denver. Sarah had built her fortune on calculated risks, on seeing opportunities others missed, and having the courage to act on them. This felt like the biggest gamble of her life, not because of what it might cost her professionally, but because of what it might cost her emotionally. What if Marcus refused to see her? What if the girls had already forgotten their airport encounter? What if 6 years of absence couldn't be bridged by good intentions and regret? What if it could? Sarah Mitchell had never been accused of lacking courage in business. It was time to find out if she had any left for the things that really mattered. The Denver flight was boarding in 3 hours, enough time to make phone calls, to rearrange schedules, to come up with a plan that was more substantial than showing up on Marcus's doorstep like some kind of desperate movie heroine. But as Sarah walked through JFK's bustling terminals, her phone already ringing her, assistant with cancellation instructions, she realized that maybe desperation wasn't the worst place to start. Maybe it was the only honest place she had left. "Jennifer," Sarah said when her assistant answered, "I need you to cancel everything for the next week. Tell the Nakamura team I'll be handling the implementation remotely, and book me on the next flight to Denver." "Denver?" Jennifer's confusion was audible. "Ma'am, you don't have any appointments in Denver and the New York meetings." "We'll have to wait," Sarah interrupted. "This is more important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. In 6 years of working together, Jennifer had never heard Sarah say anything was more important than business. "Should I ask what this is regarding?" Jennifer ventured. "In case the board or investors need to know where to reach you?" Sarah stopped walking, standing still in the middle of one of the busiest airports in the world while travelers flowed around, her like water around a stone. "How did you explain to your assistant that you'd just realized you'd spent 6 years building the wrong kind of legacy? That all the money and success and recognition in the world couldn't fill the hole left by 2 little girls who might not even remember your voice?" "It's personal," Sarah said finally. "The most personal thing I've ever done." The flight to Denver was half empty, a Tuesday evening red-eye that catered mostly to business travelers and families wrapping up spring break vacations. Sarah found herself studying every parent-child pair she could see, trying to decode the mysteries of modern family dynamics. Had parenting changed in the 6 years she'd been absent? Were there new rules, new technologies, new ways of connecting that she'd missed entirely. A woman across the aisle was helping her daughter, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with homework, their heads bent together over a tablet displaying math problems. The easy intimacy of the interaction made Sarah's throat tight. When was the last time she'd helped Emma or Sophie with anything more complicated than tying their shoes? The flight attendant offered champagne, but Sarah declined. She needed to stay clear-headed, needed to think through what she was going to say when she saw Marcus again. The airport encounter had been pure accident, raw emotion with no filter. This time, she wanted to be intentional. She wanted to be worthy of a second chance. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing. Not contracts or business plans, but something much more difficult. A letter she might never send, words she might never speak, but truths she needed to acknowledge, even if only to herself. Marcus, I know I have no right to ask for anything from you after what I did to our family. I know that showing up in Denver might feel like another selfish choice, another time when Sarah Mitchell decides what she wants is more important than what's best for everyone else. But seeing the girls today, seeing how beautiful and smart and amazing they've become, made me realize something I've been too proud and too scared to admit. I made the wrong choice 6 years ago. Not just about the custody battle, not just about the divorce, but about what I decided mattered most in life. I convinced myself that building an empire was the same as building a legacy, that providing financially was equivalent to being present emotionally, that success in business could somehow compensate for failure as a wife and mother. I was wrong about everything. I don't know if there's a way back from the mistakes I made. I don't know if Emma and Sophie could ever forgive me for choosing ambition over them, or if you could ever trust me not to break their hearts again. But I know I have to try. Because the truth is, Marcus, none of it means anything without them. Without you. The money, the recognition, the empire I built. It's all empty if I can't share it with the people who matter most. I'm not asking you to forget 6 years of hurt. I'm not asking you to take me back or let me pick up where I left off as if nothing happened. I'm just asking for the chance to show you, to show them, that I've learned who I really want to be. I want to be Emma's mum, helping with homework and bedtime stories. I want to be Sophie's mum, cheering from the sidelines at soccer games and listening to her fearless plans for changing the world. I want to be your partner again, not your adversary. I want to build something that matters more than quarterly earnings or market share. I want to build a family. If you'll let me try, Sarah. She stared at the words on the screen for a long time, then deleted the entire document without saving it. Some truths were too raw for letters, too important for emails. If she was going to bare her soul, it needed to be in person, with all the vulnerability and risk that entailed. The plane began its descent into Denver just after midnight. The city sprawled below them in a grid of golden lights, the Rocky Mountains looming like dark sentinels in the distance. Sarah had been here once before, years ago for a conference, but she'd barely seen anything beyond the hotel ballroom and airport terminal. Now she was seeing it as the place her daughters might call home, the landscape that shaped their daily lives. Sarah collected her single carry-on bag and made her way through Denver International Airport's cavernous terminals. The late hour meant fewer crowds, fewer chances of being recognized. She felt oddly invisible in her travel-rumpled Armani suit, just another business traveler at the end of a long day. The hotel she'd booked was downtown, close enough to Marcus's brother's address that she could easily reach them, but far enough away to avoid the appearance of stalking. She'd done her research during the flight. James Chen lived in Cherry Creek, an upscale neighborhood that suggested Marcus had found financial stability in his new life. Good. Whatever mistakes she'd made, whatever pain she'd caused, she was glad he'd landed on his feet. The hotel room was sterile and impersonal, all beige carpets and generic artwork. Sarah stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at Denver's quiet nighttime skyline and wondered what she was doing. 48 hours ago, her biggest concern had been the Nakamura implementation timeline. Now she was standing in a hotel room at 1 in the morning, planning to ambush her ex-husband and children with no guarantee they'd even want to see her. It was possibly the most irrational thing she'd ever done. It was also possibly the most important. Sarah set her alarm for 7 a.m. and tried to sleep. but her mind wouldn't quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sophie's fearless smile or Emma's cautious intelligence. She heard Marcus's voice saying, "I can't do this anymore," and felt the weight of 6 years of regret settling on her chest like a stone. At 5 a.m. she gave up on sleep and went to the hotel's business center. If she was going to do this, she needed a plan more sophisticated than showing up unannounced. She needed to understand the life Marcus had built here, the world Emma and Sophie inhabited when they weren't visiting their uncle. The internet yielded a treasure trove of information. Marcus's accounting firm had an excellent reputation, specializing in small business consulting and tax preparation. His LinkedIn profile showed steady growth over the past 5 years. Senior associate, then partner, now co-owner of the Denver branch. He looked successful and settled in his professional photos, the kind of man who'd found his place in the world. Emma and Sophie attended Cherry Creek Elementary, a highly rated public school with an emphasis on STEM education and creative arts. Sarah found herself scrolling through the school's website, looking at photos of science fairs and art shows, wondering if her daughter's faces might be among the smiling children in the group shots. She found what she was looking for in the school's newsletter archive, a mention of Sophie Chen scoring the winning goal in the second-grade soccer championship. The accompanying photo showed a small girl in a red jersey, arms raised in triumph, being lifted off her feet by teammates. Sarah stared at the image until tears blurred her vision. 6 years of moments like this, 6 years of pride and joy and everyday miracles she'd missed because she'd been too proud to fight for what really mattered. By 8 a.m., Sarah had showered, dressed in her most approachable outfit, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that whispered money without shouting it, and consumed enough coffee to fuel a small airplane. She'd also come up with what she hoped was a reasonable plan. She wouldn't go to James's house. That felt too invasive, too much like ambush tactics. Instead, she'd wait near the elementary school. Not in a creepy way, she wasn't that far gone, but visibly, approachably, giving Marcus the choice about whether to engage. If he was even still in Denver, they could have flown back to Seattle after their visit. They could be anywhere by now. But something told Sarah they were still here. Call it maternal instinct or wishful thinking, but she felt their presence in the city like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. Cherry Creek Elementary was a modern brick building surrounded by carefully maintained playgrounds and gardens. The morning drop-off scene was controlled chaos. Parents in SUVs and minivans, children with backpacks nearly as big as they were, crossing guards with stop signs directing traffic flow. Sarah parked across the street and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every child with dark hair made her pulse spike. Every adult male approaching the school made her wonder if this was it, if this was the moment that would determine whether she'd spend the rest of her life regretting her choices or fighting to redeem them. At 8:47 a.m., she saw them. Marcus's Honda Pilot turned into the school's circular drive, and Sarah could see 2 small figures bouncing in the back seat. Even from a distance, she could identify Sophie's animated gestures and Emma's more reserved posture. They were here. They were real. This wasn't some elaborate dream born of guilt and longing. Sarah got out of her rental car and stood beside it, making herself visible without being aggressive. She watched Marcus help the girls gather their backpacks and lunchboxes, the easy routine of a father who'd done this thousands of times. He walked them toward the school entrance, bending down to listen to something Sophie was saying with great animation. It was Emma who spotted her first. Sarah saw the exact moment recognition hit. The way Emma's steps faltered, her hand reaching out to tug on Marcus's sleeve. She saw Marcus follow Emma's gaze, saw his entire body go rigid when he realized Sarah was there. They were too far away for her to hear what was said, but she could read body language well enough to know that a rapid conversation was taking place. Sophie had spotted her now too, and was pointing with the kind of excitement that suggested she viewed this as an adventure, rather than an intrusion. Marcus looked back toward Sarah, his expression unreadable from this distance. For a long moment, they faced each other across the school's circular drive. 2 people who'd once shared everything, now strangers trying to navigate the wreckage of what they'd been. Then Marcus was walking toward her, leaving the girls at the school entrance with what appeared to be firm instructions to stay put. His stride was purposeful, but not aggressive, the walk of a man who'd made a decision but wasn't entirely comfortable with it. "Sarah," his voice was carefully neutral when he reached her. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "I know this looks crazy," Sarah began, but Marcus held up a hand. "It doesn't look crazy, it looks determined." He studied her face, and Sarah wondered what he saw there. "The question is, determined to do what?" It was a fair question. What was she determined to do? Fix the past? Claim a future she'd forfeited years ago? Prove that she was capable of putting her children before her career? All of the above, maybe. "I want to get to know them again," Sarah said simply. "Emma and Sophie. I want to know who they are now, what they love, what makes them laugh. I want to be part of their lives if you'll let me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to where the girls waited by the school entrance. Sophie was hopping from foot to foot with barely contained energy. Emma stood more still, but Sarah could see her watching their conversation with intense focus. "They ask about you sometimes," Marcus said finally. "Sophie, more than Emma, she's always been more optimistic about people. Emma remembers more of the difficult times." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma remembered the fights, the absences, the gradual dissolution of their family. Of course she would. She'd always been the more observant twin, more attuned to adult emotions and tensions. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry for all of it, Marcus. For choosing wrong, for letting pride keep me away, for missing so much of their lives. I know you are." Marcus's voice was softer now, tired in a way that spoke of old pain rather than fresh anger. "But sorry doesn't undo 6 years, Sarah. Sorry doesn't explain to an 8-year-old why her mama was too busy to come to her school play or her birthday party or any of the 100 little moments that matter." Each word was a knife to Sarah's heart, but she didn't flinch away from them. She'd earned this reckoning, had been running from it for years. The least she could do was face it with honesty. "You're right," she said. "I can't undo any of it, but I can try to do better going forward, if you'll give me the chance." The school bell rang, a clear chime that echoed across the playground. Parents began the final rush of goodbye hugs and reminders about after-school pickups. Sophie and Emma were still waiting, but Sarah could see their restlessness growing. "They need to go to class," Marcus said, but he didn't move toward them immediately. "I know, I don't want to disrupt their routine." Sarah paused, then took the biggest risk of her life. "What time do you pick them up?" It was a simple question, but loaded with implications. Was she planning to be there at pickup time? Was she asking for ongoing access to his children? Was she trying to insert herself into their daily lives without permission? Marcus seemed to understand all the subtext. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt like he was seeing past the expensive clothes and perfect makeup to the scared, hopeful woman underneath. 3:15, he said finally. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. They're not the babies you left 6 years ago. They have opinions now, preferences, fears, dreams." Emma's been seeing a counselor to help with anxiety. Some of it related to the divorce, some just her personality. Sophie's fearless on the outside, but she worries about people leaving. If you're going to be part of their lives, you have to be all in. No halfway measures, no convenient exits when work gets busy. The warning was clear and justified. Sarah had lost the right to casual parenting when she'd walked away from supervised visitation. If she wanted back in, it would be on Marcus's terms, with his daughter's well-being as the top priority. "I understand," Sarah said. "I quit." Marcus blinked. "What?" "My job. I quit. Yesterday, on the plane." Sarah felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, slightly hysterical but genuine. "Well, I didn't officially quit, but I cancelled everything for the next month and told my assistant to handle the Nakamura deal remotely. My board of directors is probably having collective heart attacks right now." Marcus stared at her as if she'd announced she was joining the circus. "Sarah, you can't just quit your job. That company is your life." "No," Sarah said firmly. "That company was my excuse. My way of avoiding the hard work of being a person instead of just a professional success story. She looked toward the school entrance, where Sophie was now waving enthusiastically at them. Those two little girls are my life. They always were, I just forgot for a while. The skepticism on Marcus's face was warranted. How many times had she promised to prioritize family over work? How many dinner reservations had she cancelled? How many bedtime stories had she missed because of urgent business calls? I know you don't believe me, Sarah continued. I know I have to prove it, not just say it. But Marcus, seeing them yesterday, it was like waking up after 6 years of sleepwalking. I don't want to be the woman who built an empire but lost her family. I want to be the woman who figured out what really mattered before it was too late. The final school bell rang, urgent and insistent. Other parents were hurrying away, leaving Marcus and Sarah alone in the suddenly quiet drop-off area. "Daddy," Sophie's voice carried across the distance. "We're going to be late." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment and Sarah could see the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. When he opened them again, his expression was cautiously neutral. 3:15, he repeated. "If you're here, we'll talk. If you're not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. If she wasn't here, it would prove that nothing had really changed, that Sarah Mitchell's promises were as empty as they'd always been. "I'll be here," Sarah said. "I'll be here every day at 3:15 if you'll let me." Marcus nodded once, then turned and jogged back toward the school entrance. Sarah watched him gather the girls, saw Sophie's enthusiastic wave in her direction, saw Emma's more reserved acknowledgement. Then they disappeared through the school's glass doors, leaving Sarah alone with 8 hours to figure out how to prove that she'd learned to put love before ambition. 8 hours to prepare for the most important job interview of her life, applying for the position of mother to 2 little girls who barely knew her. Sarah drove back to her hotel in a daze, her mind racing through possibilities and obstacles in equal measure. She'd bought herself a chance, nothing more. Now she had to figure out what to do with it. The first step was practical. She needed somewhere to stay that wasn't a hotel room if she was going to be in Denver for more than a few days. The second step was more complicated. She needed to understand who Emma and Sophie had become in her absence, what their interests and fears and dreams looked like now. The third step was the most terrifying of all. She needed to figure out who she wanted to be as their mother, how to balance the professional skills that had made her successful with the emotional availability that parenting required. Sarah had built her fortune by being methodical, by researching every angle and planning for every contingency. If she was going to win back her daughter's trust, she'd approach it the same way, with intelligence, dedication, and the kind of focused attention she'd previously reserved for quarterly earnings reports. By noon, she'd found a furnished apartment in Cherry Creek, signed a month-to-month lease and had groceries delivered. By 1 p.m., she'd researched Emma's school counselor and made an appointment to discuss how to support a child with anxiety. By 2 p.m., she'd found the local soccer league's website and was reading about registration for spring season. At 2:45 p.m., Sarah stood outside Cherry Creek Elementary again, but this time she wasn't lurking across the street. This time she was part of the pickup crowd, another parent, waiting for school to end. The other mothers and a few fathers eyed her curiously. Sarah's designer clothes marked her as either new money or out-of-town money, neither of which blended seamlessly into the comfortable suburban ecosystem. But she smiled politely when introduced, made appropriate small talk about the weather and spring break plans, and tried to look like she belonged. At exactly 3:15, the school doors opened and children poured out like water from a dam. Sarah's heart hammered as she searched the crowd for familiar faces, and then there they were. Emma walking with careful precision, backpack properly arranged, while Sophie bounded beside her with characteristic energy. They spotted her immediately. Sophie broke into a run, her backpack bouncing behind her, while Emma followed more cautiously. Sarah knelt down as Sophie barreled into her arms, the impact of the hug nearly knocking her over. "You came back," Sophie announced, as if Sarah's presence was the best possible outcome. "Emma said you probably wouldn't, but I knew you would because you promised." Sarah's throat tightened. She looked over Sophie's head at Emma, who was hanging back with wariness written across her features. "I keep my promises," Sarah said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Marcus appeared a moment later, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert. He was watching for signs of Sarah's discomfort, Sarah realized, waiting for her to make excuses about important calls or urgent meetings that would require her immediate attention. Instead, Sarah stood up, keeping one arm around Sophie, and extended her other hand toward Emma. "Would you like to get ice cream?" she asked. "I saw a place down the street that looked good." Emma studied her with the intensity of a much older child. "What kind of ice cream do I like?" It was a test, and Sarah knew it. Emma was asking whether her mother had paid enough attention during those early years to remember her preferences, whether Sarah's memories of her daughters extended beyond the vague warmth of maternal sentiment. "Strawberry," Sarah said without hesitation. "With rainbow sprinkles, but only if they don't touch the ice cream directly because you don't like the way they feel in your mouth." Emma's eyes widened with surprise. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "And Sophie likes chocolate chip cookie dough," Sarah continued, "but she always asks for extra cookie dough pieces and then picks them out to eat separately." "How did you remember that?" Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Because I remember everything about you," Sarah thought, but didn't say. "Because even when I was on the other side of the world, making deals that seemed so important at the time, part of my brain was cataloging every detail of your personalities, storing them up against the day when I'd be brave enough to come back." "Moms remember important things," she said simply. Marcus was looking at her with something that might have been surprised approval. "Ice cream sounds good," he said, "but just so you know, Sophie's not allowed to have sugar after 4 p.m. on school nights." "Right, of course." Sarah felt a flutter of panic. There were rules now, routines she didn't know, boundaries she hadn't learned. How did you parent children you'd been absent from for 6 years? How did you balance being permissive enough to win their affection with being responsible enough to earn their father's trust? The ice cream shop was a local institution called Scoops, all checkered floors and vintage charm. The girls pressed their faces against the glass display case, with the kind of focus usually reserved for national emergencies, debating flavors with the seriousness of UN negotiators. Sarah found herself studying Marcus while the girls deliberated. He looked relaxed here, comfortable in his role as the parent who knew all the rules and rhythms, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze kept flicking between her and the girls, as if he were calculating some complex equation involving risk and reward. "2 scoops?" Sophie asked hopefully. "1 scoop," Marcus replied automatically. "You know the rule." "But it's a special occasion," Sophie protested. "Mama's here." The casual way she said "Mama" hit Sarah like a physical blow, as if the title still belonged to her, as if 6 years of absence hadn't severed that fundamental connection. Sarah looked at Marcus, asking silent permission. After a moment, he nodded. "Special occasion rules," Sarah said. 2 scoops. Sophie's whoop of joy was worth every calorie. Even Emma smiled as she pointed to her choices, strawberry and vanilla, with rainbow sprinkles on the side, exactly as Sarah had predicted. They found a table by the window, the afternoon sun streaming across the checkered floor. Sarah sat across from her daughters and tried to memorize everything, the way Emma carefully arranged her napkin, the way Sophie attacked her ice cream with unrestrained enthusiasm, the way they both looked when they laughed at something funny. "Tell me about school," Sarah said. "What's your favorite subject?" "Science," Sophie announced immediately. "We're learning about volcanoes and earthquakes and how mountains are made. Did you know that the Rocky Mountains are still growing?" "I didn't know that," Sarah said, though she suspected she'd known it once filed away in the part of her brain that collected random facts. "What about you, Emma?" Emma was more thoughtful. "I like reading. And art class. We're doing a unit on perspective, like how to make things look 3-dimensional on flat paper." "That sounds complicated." "It is," Emma said with satisfaction. "But once you understand the rules, it makes sense. Everything has to have the same vanishing point or it looks wrong." Sarah found herself thinking about vanishing points in her own life, all the moments when she'd lost perspective, when her priorities had gotten skewed beyond recognition. Maybe Emma could teach her about more than just art. The conversation flowed easier than Sarah had dared hope. Sophie was a natural entertainer, regaling them with stories about recess drama and cafeteria mysteries. Emma was quieter but no less engaging, offering observations about teachers and classmates that showed a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics. Marcus mostly listened, but Sarah could feel his attention like a weight. He was cataloging this interaction, she realized, gathering data about whether she could handle the mundane responsibilities of parenthood, or if she'd grow bored once the novelty wore off. It was a fair concern. Sarah had always been better at grand gestures than daily maintenance, more comfortable with dramatic declarations than quiet consistency. But watching Emma carefully eat around the rainbow sprinkles and listening to Sophie's elaborate theory about why chocolate chip cookies were scientifically superior to other desserts, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace, contentment, the bone-deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. "What's your job like now, Mama?" Emma asked suddenly. "Daddy says you run a big company." Sarah glanced at Marcus, who shrugged. As if to say the girls had asked, he'd answered. Another test then. Would Sarah launch into corporate speak about market penetration and quarterly projections, or would she find a way to make her work accessible to 8-year-old minds? "I help people start businesses," Sarah said simply. "Like if someone has a good idea for a new kind of toy or restaurant, I help them figure out how to make it real." "That sounds fun," Sophie said. "Do you help people make ice cream shops?" "I could," Sarah said. "Would you like to own an ice cream shop someday?" Sophie's eyes lit up with possibility. "Could I make up new flavors, like pickle ice cream or pizza ice cream?" "Those sound terrible," Emma said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "They sound creative," Sarah corrected gently. "Some of the best inventions sound terrible until someone brave enough tries them." She was talking to Sophie, but looking at Emma, hoping her older daughter would understand that she was talking about more than ice cream flavors. Some of the best ideas, like second chances, like forgiveness, like rebuilding trust, seemed impossible until someone was brave enough to try. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a slight frown. "Sorry, just work stuff." "Go ahead," Sarah said. "Answer it." Marcus looked surprised. The Sarah he'd been married to would have been annoyed by the interruption, would have made pointed comments about people who couldn't disconnect from their phones during family time. "It can wait," Marcus said. "No, really. I understand how work calls can be urgent." Sarah smiled ruefully. "Trust me, I'm an expert on putting work ahead of everything else, but I'm trying to learn better priorities." Marcus studied her face for a moment, then answered the call. It was brief, a client with a tax question that needed immediate attention, and Sarah found herself studying his professional demeanor with new eyes. He was confident, knowledgeable, reassuring. This version of Marcus had grown into his authority in a way the younger man she'd married hadn't quite managed. "Sorry about that," he said when he hung up. "Don't apologize. You're good at what you do. I can hear it in your voice." Sarah meant it. Whatever resentments had poisoned their marriage, she'd never doubted Marcus's intelligence or competence. The girls must be proud of having such a smart dad. Emma and Sophie exchanged a look that spoke of private conversations about their parents. Sarah wondered what they'd been told about the divorce, what version of events had shaped their understanding of why their family had fallen apart. "Daddy works a lot," Emma said carefully, "but not as much as you used to." The observation was delivered without malice, but it still cut deep, out of the mouths of babes. Emma had been paying attention even at age 2, had absorbed the dynamics that had ultimately destroyed their marriage. "You're right," Sarah said. "I used to work too much. I thought I was doing it for the family, but really I was doing it because I was scared." "Scared of what?" Sophie asked, ice cream forgotten. Sarah looked at Marcus, silently asking permission to have this conversation. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "Scared of not being good enough," Sarah said honestly. "Scared that if I wasn't the best at everything, people wouldn't love me anymore." It was a simplified version of the truth, but an accurate one. Underneath all the ambition and drive had been a fundamental insecurity, a belief that her worth was tied to her achievements, rather than her inherent value as a person. "That's silly," Sophie announced. "People love you because you're you, not because of your job." "You're very wise," Sarah said, and meant it. "It took me a long time to learn what you already know." Emma was quiet, processing this revelation with her typical intensity. Finally, she asked, "Are you still scared?" Sarah considered lying, offering platitudes about personal growth and lessons learned. Instead, she decided on honesty. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Right now, actually. I'm scared you might not want me to be your mama anymore. I'm scared I've missed too much to ever catch up, but I'm trying to be brave anyway." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Emma said matter-of-factly. "It means doing the right thing, even when you're scared." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Her 8-year-old daughter had just articulated what it had taken Sarah decades to understand. When had Emma become so wise? What other insights had she developed during the years Sarah had missed? Marcus was looking between his daughters and his ex-wife with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, at how naturally this conversation was flowing, or concern about whether Sarah's emotional revelations were appropriate for children this age. "We should probably head home," he said gently. "The girls have homework and it's a school night." Sarah felt a familiar stab of disappointment, the same feeling she'd experienced as a child when fun activities came to an end. But this time, instead of trying to extend the moment or negotiate for more time, she nodded, understanding. "Of course, I don't want to mess up your routine." The girls gathered their jackets and backpacks with the efficiency of long practice. Sophie hugged Sarah goodbye with characteristic enthusiasm, while Emma offered a more reserved but genuine embrace. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Sophie asked. Sarah looked at Marcus, once again asking silent permission. After a moment that felt like hours, he nodded. "I'll be here," Sarah promised. As they walked toward the parking area, Emma slipped her small hand into Sarah's. The gesture was casual, unconscious, but it hit Sarah with the force of revelation. Maybe trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but connection, that fundamental bond between mother and child, was still there, dormant but not destroyed. Marcus walked them to Sarah's rental car, the girls skipping ahead in the golden afternoon light. For a moment, they looked like a normal family completing a normal day, and Sarah allowed herself to imagine what that might feel like as a regular occurrence rather than a miraculous exception. "Thank you," she said quietly to Marcus, "for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it." "It's not about what you deserve," Marcus replied. "It's about what they need. Emma and Sophie deserve to know their mother, if their mother is ready to actually be present for them." The conditional was clear. This wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a reunion. It was a trial period, a chance to prove that Sarah had genuinely changed rather than simply rearranging her priorities temporarily. "I understand," Sarah said. "And Marcus, I know this is awkward and complicated, but I want you to know that you've done an amazing job with them. They're incredible kids, and that's because you've been an incredible father." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "They're pretty great, aren't they? They're perfect." Sarah meant it with every fiber of her being. "I just hope I can learn to be the mother they deserve." As Sarah drove back to her temporary apartment, she found herself thinking about vanishing points again. Emma's art lesson about perspective, and how all elements in a drawing had to relate to the same focal point, or everything looked wrong. For 6 years, Sarah's vanishing point had been professional success. Everything in her life had been oriented toward that single goal, which had made her personal relationships look distorted and out of proportion. Maybe it was time to choose a different vanishing point. Maybe it was time to orient everything toward love instead of achievement, toward presence instead of productivity. Maybe it was time to learn how to draw her life in proper perspective. The next morning, Sarah was at the school pickup area 10 minutes early, armed with homemade cookies and a determination to prove that yesterday hadn't been a fluke. She'd spent the evening researching child development and anxiety management, trying to catch up on 6 years of parenting education in a single night. The other parents were starting to accept her presence, offering polite nods and including her in Conversations about upcoming school events. Sarah learned about the Spring Carnival, the third-grade field trip to the Natural History Museum, the ongoing fundraiser for new playground equipment. Normal life. The rhythms and concerns of families who showed up consistently, who were woven into the fabric of their children's daily experience. When the school bell rang and the children poured out, Sarah felt the same heart-stopping joy she'd experienced the day before. Emma and Sophie spotted her immediately, and this time Emma's smile was as bright as her sister's. "Mama!" Sophie launched herself into Sarah's arms. "Guess what happened in science today?" "What happened?" "We made volcanoes with baking soda and vinegar and food coloring. Mine was the biggest eruption in the whole class." Sarah found herself laughing, caught up in Sophie's infectious enthusiasm. She looked at Emma, who was approaching more sedately, but with obvious pleasure. "How was art class?" Sarah asked. "Good. I finished my perspective drawing. Ms. Rodriguez said it showed real understanding of spatial relationships." Emma's pride was quiet but unmistakable. "I'd love to see it sometime, if you're willing to show me." Emma nodded seriously. "I could show you at home. Daddy says you can come for dinner tonight if you want." Sarah's heart stopped. Dinner. At home. The casual invitation felt like crossing some invisible threshold, from stranger to family member, from outsider to someone with standing. She looked around for Marcus and spotted him talking with another parent near the school entrance. When he caught her eye, he walked over with that careful neutrality she was learning to read as cautious hope rather than indifference. "The girls mentioned dinner," Sarah said carefully. "I don't want to impose if it's not a good time." "It's not imposing," Marcus replied. "I thought, well, if you're serious about being part of their lives, you should see what that actually looks like. Homework time, bath time, the whole routine." Another test, but a different kind. This wasn't about whether Sarah could handle the fun parts of parenting, ice cream and laughter and adorable conversations. This was about whether she could handle the mundane responsibilities, the daily grind that defined most of family life. "I'd like that," Sarah said simply. "I'd like to see their world." Marcus's house was a modest two-story colonial in an established neighborhood, the kind of place where children rode bikes in the street and neighbors knew each other's names. The front yard showed evidence of careful maintenance and kid-friendly modifications, a basketball hoop, flower boxes that had probably been planted as a school project, a tire swing hanging from an ancient oak tree. Inside, the house was comfortable rather than elegant, lived in rather than showcase perfect. The walls were covered with school artwork and family photos, the refrigerator decorated with permission slips and soccer schedules and reminders about upcoming events. Sarah found herself studying the photos with fascination and heartbreak. 6 years of birthdays and holidays and everyday moments, a visual record of the life her daughters had built without her. Emma learning to ride a bike, Sophie's first day of kindergarten, both girls covered in flour while helping Marcus with some ambitious baking project. But what struck her most was what wasn't there. No photos of Sarah, no evidence of her existence in their family story. It was as if she'd been edited out completely, erased from the narrative of their lives. "Mama, look!" Sophie had found her art supplies and was spreading them across the kitchen table with characteristic enthusiasm. "I'm going to make you a picture." Emma disappeared upstairs and returned with a carefully preserved drawing, her perspective exercise showing a street scene with buildings that receded toward a properly positioned vanishing point. The technical skill was impressive for an 8-year-old, but what struck Sarah more was the attention to detail, the careful observation that had gone into creating the scene. "This is beautiful, Emma. You really understand how perspective works." "Ms. Rodriguez says perspective is about knowing where you're standing when you look at something," Emma explained seriously. "Like the same building can look big or small, depending on how close you are." Sarah found herself thinking about perspective in more than artistic terms. How had her priorities looked from Marcus's viewpoint during their marriage? How had her choices appeared to 2-year-old Emma and Sophie when their mother gradually became a stranger, who visited sporadically and always seemed distracted by work calls? Dinner was a revelation in organized chaos. Marcus moved through the routine with practiced efficiency, homework supervision. At the kitchen table, vegetable negotiations that would have impressed UN peacekeepers, the delicate balance between structure and flexibility that defined successful parenting. Sarah watched and learned, occasionally helping where she could, but mostly absorbing the rhythms of family life. Emma needed quiet space for concentration, preferring to work through math problems independently before asking for help. Sophie was more collaborative, thinking out loud and seeking frequent reassurance that she was on the right track. "Mama, what's 8 plus 6? Sophie asked, even though the answer was written in her workbook. "What do you think it is?" Sarah replied, remembering advice from one of the parenting articles she devoured the night before, about encouraging children to work through problems themselves. Sophie counted on her fingers, her face scrunched in concentration. 14. That's right. How did you figure that out? I counted 8 in my head, then added 6 more with my fingers. Emma taught me that trick. Sarah glanced at Emma, who was helping herself to more vegetables without being asked, a small gesture that spoke of maturity and self-awareness beyond her years. "Emma's a good teacher," Sarah said. "Are you good at math too, Emma?" "It's okay," Emma replied with characteristic modesty. "I like word problems better than just numbers. They tell stories." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of family life in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. Bath time negotiations, the hunt for matching pajamas, the elaborate bedtime ritual that involved specific stuffed animals arranged in precise order. She watched Marcus navigate these routines with the kind of patient competence that came from years of practice. He knew Sophie needed her elephant positioned just so, that Emma preferred to read for 10 minutes before lights out, that both girls required a glass of water and exactly 3 more minutes of conversation before they could settle down to sleep. "Can Mama read us a story?" Sophie asked as Marcus was tucking them in. Sarah's heart stopped. She looked at Marcus, once again seeking permission for this small but significant privilege. "Do you remember any of the old stories?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah's throat tightened. Did she remember? She remembered every single bedtime story she'd ever told them, every silly voice and dramatic pause and improvised adventure. The 3 little pigs who became architects, Goldilocks and the bear's interior design business, the princess who saved herself and started a dragon rescue service. "I remember some," she said carefully. "Tell the one about the princess and the dragons." Sophie bounced in her bed with excitement. Sarah settled into the chair beside Emma's bed, the same chair she'd occupied every night for the first 2 years of their lives. The familiar weight of the moment, 2 little girls in matching pajamas, stuffed animals arranged like an audience, the soft glow of the nightlight casting gentle shadows, transported her back to a time when this had been her world. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "there was a princess who lived in a beautiful castle with everything she could ever want. But the princess wasn't happy because she spent all her time counting her treasures instead of enjoying them." Emma's eyes widened. This wasn't quite the version she remembered. "One day," Sarah continued, "the princess heard that dragons were in trouble. Not scary, dangerous dragons, but gentle dragons who had lost their way home. Everyone in the kingdom said the dragons were too dangerous to help, that the princess should stay safely in her castle. But she didn't," Sophie predicted, snuggling deeper into her covers. "But she didn't," Sarah agreed. "The princess realized that all her treasures meant nothing if she couldn't use them to help others. So she left her castle and went looking for the dragons." Sarah spun out the familiar tale with new layers, the story of a princess who learned that true wealth came from connection rather than accumulation, that the greatest adventures required leaving the safety of familiar walls. As she spoke, Sarah watched her daughters' faces in the dim light. Emma's initial surprise had given way to thoughtful attention, as if she were analyzing the story for deeper meaning. Sophie was simply enjoying the adventure, making soft sound effects for the dragons and giggling at the funny voices. But it was Marcus's expression that made Sarah's heart race. He was leaning against the doorframe, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't dared hope for. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. As if he were seeing glimpses of the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who'd gotten lost in boardrooms and quarterly reports, but might still be findable. And they all lived happily ever after, Sarah concluded, because the princess learned that the best treasures are the ones you share with people you love. That's a good story, Mama, Sophie said sleepily. Will you tell it again tomorrow? If Daddy says it's okay and if you're good at school. Emma was quiet for a moment, then asked, Mama, in the story, does the princess miss her castle while she's helping the dragons? The question was loaded with meaning that went far beyond fairy to tales. Emma was asking whether Sarah missed her old life, whether the sacrifice of leaving her empire behind felt like loss or liberation. Sometimes, Sarah answered honestly. The castle was beautiful and safe, and the princess had worked very hard to build it. But she realized that a castle isn't a home if you're the only one living in it. Emma nodded solemnly, satisfied with this answer. Sophie was already drifting towards sleep, her breathing growing slow and even. Sarah kissed. Both girls good night, breathing in the sweet scent of clean hair and childhood innocence. As she stood to leave, Emma's small hand caught hers. Mama? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. I'm glad you came back to help the dragons. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she couldn't stop. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Marcus walked her downstairs while the girls settled into sleep. The house was quiet now, filled with the peaceful exhaustion that followed successful parenting. Sarah found herself reluctant to break the spell by leaving. Thank you, she said softly, for letting me be part of this, for letting me see what I almost missed forever. Marcus poured himself a glass of wine and offered her one, which she accepted gratefully. They settled on the couch, carefully maintaining distance but no longer treating each other like strangers. They're remarkable, Sarah said. Both of them. Emma's emotional intelligence, Sophie's fearless optimism. Marcus, you've raised incredible children. We raised incredible children, Marcus corrected quietly. Those first 2 years, before everything fell apart, they were shaped by that time too. By having a mother who sang to them every night and read them stories and made them feel like the center of the universe. Sarah's breath caught. She'd assumed that her early influence had been erased by the trauma of the divorce, that 6 years of absence had wiped clean whatever foundation she'd helped build. Do they really remember? She asked. Emma remembers more than she lets on. Sophie remembers feelings more than specific events. She remembers being loved, being safe, having 2 parents who adored her. Marcus took a sip of wine before continuing. That's why this is so hard, Sarah. It's not that they don't love you, it's that they love you enough to be hurt by your absence. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch away from them. Marcus was right. Love wasn't the issue. It was trust, consistency, the daily proof that she could prioritize their needs over her own desires. I know I can't undo 6 years of damage overnight, Sarah said. But Marcus, I need you to know. This isn't a whim or a midlife crisis, or some kind of publicity stunt. I meant what I said about quitting. I meant what I said about changing my priorities. Marcus studied her face in the soft lamplight. What does that actually mean, though? You can't just stop. Being Sarah Mitchell, CEO, that company employs thousands of people. You have responsibilities, obligations. I have other responsibilities now, Sarah interrupted. More important ones. I can run Mitchell Industries remotely, hire a CEO to handle day-to-day operations, restructure my role to be strategic rather than operational. I've built something that can function without me micromanaging every decision. And if there's a crisis, if something happens that requires your immediate attention. It was a fair question, and one Sarah had been wrestling with since she'd made her impulsive decision on the plane. In the old days, she would have had a dozen contingency plans, backup strategies, ways to maintain control even from a distance. Now she had a different answer. Then I'll handle it the way any working parent handles competing priorities, she said simply. I'll do my best to balance both responsibilities, but if I have to choose, I'll choose Emma and Sophie every time. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in his glass. Sarah could see him weighing her words against 6 years of broken promises and competing priorities. They have a soccer game on Saturday, he said finally. Sophie's team made it to the championship round. Sarah's heart leaped. Can I come? I mean, Would it be okay if I came to watch? Sophie would love it. Emma's more cautious about public displays. She worries about what other people think, whether they're watching us instead of the game. Marcus's expression grew serious. Sarah, if you're going to be part of their lives, you need to understand that everything you do reflects on them. They're not just Emma and Sophie anymore. They're the daughters of Sarah Mitchell, the billionaire CEO. That comes with baggage. Sarah hadn't considered the celebrity aspect of her reintegration into their lives. She'd been so focused on the emotional challenges that she'd forgotten about the practical complications of being a public figure trying to live a normal family life. I can be discreet, she offered. Sunglasses, baseball cap, sit in the back. Marcus almost smiled. You really think you can blend in at a suburban soccer game? Sarah, you're worth almost $3 billion. You've been on the cover of Fortune magazine. Discreet isn't really an option anymore. He was right, of course. Sarah's success had made her recognizable, had turned her personal life into potential entertainment for strangers. How did you protect children from that kind of scrutiny? How did you give them normal childhoods when one of their parents was constantly being photographed and interviewed and dissected by the media? Then I'll hire security, Sarah said. Create a buffer between the family section and anyone with cameras. Make it clear that the girls are off limits. You can't control everything, Sarah, and more importantly, you shouldn't have to. Emma and Sophie deserve to live normal lives, not to be props in their mother's redemption story. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth Sarah didn't want to acknowledge. Was her desire to reconnect with her daughters genuine, or was it partially motivated by a need to rehabilitate her public image? Was she trying to prove to the world that she could have it all, or was she trying to prove it to herself? I'm not doing this for publicity, Sarah said firmly. I'm doing this because I love them, because I've spent 6 years pretending that professional success could fill the hole they left in my life, and I finally admitted to myself that it can't. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt as if he was seeing past her carefully constructed defenses to the vulnerable woman underneath. I want to believe you, he said softly, for their sake, for your sake, hell, for my sake too. Do you know how hard it's been being the only parent, making every decision alone, having no one to share the worries and the joys with? Sarah's chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. Guilt, yes, but also something deeper. Grief for the partnership they'd lost, the shared burden of parenting that she'd abandoned when she'd chosen ambition over family. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for leaving you to handle everything alone. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, Marcus said. I'm telling you this because maybe there's room in their lives for both of us. Maybe there's room in their lives for a mother who's learned to put family first. Hope flared in Sarah's chest, bright and terrifying. Was Marcus suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? Not reconciliation. They were too far past that for simple reunion, but co-parenting, shared responsibility, a chance to build something new from the ashes of what they'd been. What would that look like? Sarah asked carefully. I don't know, Marcus admitted. We'd have to figure it out as we go, slowly, carefully, with their well-being as the top priority and our own feelings secondary to their needs. Sarah nodded, understanding the parameters he was setting. This wasn't about second chances for their marriage. That ship had sailed years ago. This was about creating a new kind of family structure, one that acknowledged the reality of their shared children and their individual growth. As people. I'd like that, Sarah said. I'd like to try. Marcus finished his wine and set the glass aside. Saturday's game starts at 10 a.m. Cherry Creek Community Park, Field 3. If you're serious about this, about being present for the important moments, that's where you can start. Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips. I'll be there, front row, cheering louder than anyone. Just try to blend in a little, okay? Sophie loves the attention, but Emma gets overwhelmed by too much focus. Sarah nodded, filing away another piece of information about her daughter's personalities. Emma needed space to process, while Sophie thrived on interaction. Different children, different needs, different approaches required. She gathered her purse and jacket, reluctant to end the evening but understanding that pushing for more time would be counterproductive. Trust had to be built gradually, through consistency rather than intensity. "Thank you," she said again, as Marcus walked her to the door. "For tonight, for Saturday, for giving me the chance to learn how to be their mother again." Marcus paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for Emma and Sophie, because they deserve to have a mother who shows up for them. If you disappoint them again, if you choose work over family when it really matters, I will protect them from any further hurt, even if it means cutting you out of their lives permanently." The warning was delivered gently but with absolute conviction. Marcus had learned to be fierce in his role as their protector, and Sarah respected him for it, even as it terrified her. "I understand," she said. "And Marcus, I hope someday I can earn your trust again too. Not as your ex-wife, but as someone you can rely on to put Emma and Sophie first." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a soccer championship. Sarah arrived at Cherry Creek Community Park 45 minutes early, having spent the morning in careful preparation. Jeans instead of designer clothes, minimal makeup, hair in a simple ponytail. She looked like any other soccer mom, if soccer moms typically arrived in Maseratis. She'd hired discreet security, 2 professionals who looked like parents themselves, positioned strategically around the field perimeter. Not to create barriers, but to discourage anyone who might think photographing children at a soccer game was appropriate entertainment. The team was warming up when Sarah found Marcus in the parent section. Emma sat beside him, carefully organizing a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook, her own way of coping with the excitement and anxiety of competition. "You came!" Sophie spotted her from across the field and waved enthusiastically before remembering she was supposed to be focusing on warm-up drills. Sarah settled onto the bleachers beside Emma, who offered a shy smile and scooted closer. "I brought these in case you get bored," Emma said, offering Sarah a handful of colored pencils. "Sometimes the games are long." "Thank you, sweetheart. What are you drawing?" Emma showed her the sketchbook, detailed drawings of the soccer field from various angles, each one demonstrating her growing understanding of perspective and spatial relationships. "I'm documenting the season," Emma explained seriously, "for Sophie so she can remember all the games when she's older." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. Emma was creating a visual record of her sister's achievements, preserving memories with the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything she did. "That's a beautiful gift," Sarah said. "Sophie's lucky to have such a thoughtful sister." "She'd do the same for me," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "That's what family does." The simple statement contained universes of meaning. Family showed up for each other. Family preserved important moments. Family created records of love and support that could be revisited during difficult times. The game was intensely competitive, with both teams displaying impressive skill for 8-year-olds. Sophie played midfielder, her natural energy and fearless attitude making her a formidable opponent. Sarah found herself on her feet during crucial plays, cheering with the unbridled enthusiasm of a parent who'd waited 6 years to watch her daughter pursue her dreams. "She's good," Marcus said during halftime, pride evident in his voice. "Really good. Her coach thinks she could play competitively in high school if she keeps developing." Sarah watched Sophie joking with her teammates, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. "She loves it. You can see it in everything she does, the way she moves, the way she talks to her teammates." "Emma's been Sophie's biggest supporter," Marcus continued. "She comes to every game, documents everything. Last year she made a scrapbook of the whole season as Sophie's Christmas present." Sarah glanced at Emma, who was intently sketching the halftime team huddle. "She has such a generous heart." "She gets that from you," Marcus said quietly. "The way you used to remember everything that mattered to people. The way you'd go out of your way to make others feel special." The observation caught Sarah off guard. She'd spent 6 years thinking of herself as selfish, as someone who'd chosen ambition over love. But Marcus was reminding her of who she'd been before fear had twisted her priorities out of recognition. The second half was even more intense than the first. With 2 minutes left on the clock and the score tied 2-2, Sophie's team earned a corner kick. Sarah found herself gripping Emma's hand as they watched Sophie position herself near the goal. The kick was perfect, sailing across the penalty area in a high arc. Sophie jumped, her timing flawless, and connected with the ball in a header that sent it soaring past the goalkeeper and into the net. The parent section erupted in cheers. Sarah found herself crying and laughing simultaneously, overwhelmed by pride and joy and the simple miracle of being present for this moment. Sophie was mobbed by her teammates, her face radiant with triumph. But what made Sarah's heart truly soar was what happened next. Sophie broke free from the celebration and ran straight to the sideline, pointing directly at her family in the stands. At Emma, who was sketching frantically to capture the moment. At Marcus, who was cheering with unrestrained pride. And at Sarah, who was crying too hard to speak. "That's my mama," Sophie shouted to anyone within earshot. "My mama came to watch me play." Sarah felt something break open in her chest, not painful, but liberating. Like walls she'd built around her heart were finally crumbling, letting in light and love and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of redemption. After the game, after the trophy presentation and team photos and congratulations from other parents, the four of them walked across the park together. Sophie was still bouncing with excitement, reliving every play in vivid detail. Emma walked beside Sarah, showing her the sketches she'd made throughout the game. "This one's my favorite," Emma said, pointing to a drawing of Sophie's winning goal. "I got the trajectory of the ball just right." "It's perfect," Sarah said. "You've captured the whole moment." Marcus had been quiet since the game ended, but Sarah could feel his attention like warmth on her skin. When Sophie ran ahead to climb on the playground equipment and Emma settled at a picnic table to add finishing touches to her sketches, he finally spoke. "She asked me last week if you were really coming back," he said quietly. "Sophie, I mean. She wanted to know if this was temporary or if you were going to be part of their lives for real." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, that it depended on you, on what you decided was most important." Marcus watched Sophie navigate the monkey bars with determined concentration. "But watching you today, seeing how you looked at her when she scored, I think I have my answer." "And what's that?" Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression more open than it had been since their airport encounter. "I think you're home, Sarah. Really home, in a way you never were before." The words hit Sarah like absolution, like forgiveness, like the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. But they also carried weight, responsibility, expectation, the promise that this time would be different. "I am home," Sarah said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "This is where I belong, with them, with all of you." Marcus nodded slowly. "So, what happens now? You can't live in a hotel forever, and the girls need stability, routine." It was a practical question with complicated implications. Sarah had her temporary apartment, but that was meant to be short-term. She had a house in Seattle, a penthouse in Manhattan, properties in 3 countries, but none of them were home in the way that mattered. "I want to find something here in Denver," Sarah said, "close enough to be part of their daily lives, far enough away to give you space. I want to be the parent who shows up for soccer games and school plays and dentist appointments. I want to be someone they can count on." That's a big change from the woman who used to run board meetings from the hospital while in labor. Sarah winced. She'd forgotten that Marcus remembered that particular low point, the emergency C-section that had arrived during a crucial merger negotiation, her insistence on participating in conference calls while still in recovery. "That woman was scared," Sarah said honestly. Scared. That if she wasn't indispensable professionally, she'd be expendable personally. It took me 6 years to realize that the opposite was true. Sophie had finished her playground exploration and was now showing Emma how to properly hang upside down from the monkey bars, both girls giggling at their inverted perspective of the world. "Look, Mama," Sophie called. "Everything looks different when you're upside down." Sarah found herself laughing. "That's very philosophical, sweetheart." "Or what's philosophical mean?" "It means you're thinking deep thoughts about how the world works." Sophie considered this seriously. "Then I'm always philosophical. Emma says I ask too many questions." "There's no such thing as too many questions," Sarah assured her. "Questions are how we learn about everything." As they packed up to leave, Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. This was the moment, the choice between returning to her old life or committing fully to building a new one. She pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant. "Jennifer, I need you to set up a meeting with the board for next week. We're going to discuss bringing in a CEO to handle daily operations." "No, I'm not stepping down entirely, but I am restructuring my role to be strategic rather than operational, because I'm relocating to Denver and my priorities have changed." She could hear Jennifer's shock through the phone, could imagine the chaos this announcement would create among her investors and business partners. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd built a global empire through sheer force of will, was choosing family over fortune. "Also," Sarah continued, "I want you to start looking at properties in the Denver area. Something family-friendly, close to good schools. I want to be settled before the girls start 4th grade." When she hung up, Marcus was looking at her with something approaching amazement. "You're really doing this," he said. "You're really changing your entire life." "I'm not changing my life," Sarah corrected. "I'm finally starting to live it." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of her new house, a 4-bedroom colonial just 8 blocks from Marcus's place, watching Emma and Sophie help her unpack dishes. The morning routine had become as natural as breathing. School drop-off shared with Marcus, pick-up duty alternating based on their schedules, homework supervision that took advantage of both parents' strengths. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been difficult conversations about boundaries and expectations, moments when old patterns of control and perfectionism had threatened to resurface. Sarah had learned to sit through Emma's anxious moments without trying to fix them immediately, to channel Sophie's endless energy without overwhelming her with activities. She'd also learned to navigate the media attention that came with a billionaire CEO's decision to prioritize family over empire. The business press had been predictably critical, headlines about falling off the power grid and losing competitive edge. But Sarah found she didn't care about their opinions anymore. What mattered was the drawing Emma had made of their new house, carefully labeled home in her precise handwriting. What mattered was Sophie's excited chatter about the neighborhood park where she could practice soccer every evening. What mattered was the gradual rebuilding of trust, one consistent day at a time. Mitchell Industries was thriving under its new CEO, a brilliant woman Sarah had mentored for years who brought fresh perspectives to global expansion. Sarah maintained her role as executive chair, participating in strategic decisions remotely and traveling for crucial negotiations only when absolutely necessary, and only when it didn't conflict with parent-teacher conferences or soccer games or the million small moments that defined family life. The doorbell rang, and Sarah heard Marcus's voice in the entryway. He'd gotten into the habit of stopping by after work, ostensibly to coordinate schedules, but really because the 4 of them had developed a friendship that transcended their complicated history. "Smells good in here," Marcus said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "What's for dinner?" "Sophie's choice," Sarah replied. "Spaghetti with meatballs and extra cheese." "And vegetables," Emma added pointedly. "We voted and vegetables won." Marcus laughed. "Democracy in action. I'm impressed." As they settled around the dinner table, a ritual Sarah had fought to establish despite everyone's busy schedules, Sarah found herself marveling at the ordinary magic of the moment. Homework spread across one end of the table, Sophie's soccer cleats drying by the back door, Emma's latest art project propped against the windowsill. Normal life. The kind of mundane, precious normalcy she'd sacrificed in pursuit of extraordinary success. "Mama," Sophie said around a mouthful of spaghetti, "Jessica's mom wants to know if you can help with the school fundraiser. She says you know about business stuff." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. PTA involvement meant committees and meetings, and the kind of time commitment that could easily spiral out of control. The old Sarah would have either declined immediately or taken over the entire project with corporate efficiency. "What kind of help do they need?" Sarah asked. "Just ideas," Emma said. "Mrs. Peterson says they want to raise money for new library books, but they don't know how to make it fun so people will participate." Sarah considered the request. A library fundraiser, something that would benefit Emma and Sophie directly, that would engage the entire school community, the kind of project that could use her business skills without consuming her family time. "I could help with planning," Sarah said carefully, "as long as it doesn't interfere with soccer season or art show preparation." Marcus smiled at her diplomatic response. "Look at you, setting boundaries like a real person." "I'm learning," Sarah admitted. "Slowly, but learning." After dinner, while the girls worked on homework and Marcus loaded the dishwasher, Sarah found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at their backyard. Emma had claimed a corner for a garden project, carefully tending tomato plants and sunflowers, with the same meticulous attention she brought to her artwork. Sophie had set up a makeshift soccer goal against the back fence, the grass worn thin from hours of practice. It was a good life. Not the life she'd planned when she was 28 and convinced she could have everything if she just worked hard enough, but a better life, richer in the ways that actually mattered. "Regrets?" Marcus asked softly, joining her at the window. Sarah considered the question seriously. Did she regret the years of ambition, the empire she'd built, the recognition she'd earned? Did she regret the cost of that success, the family she'd nearly lost forever? "I regret the lost time," she said finally. "I regret missing so much of who they became, but I don't regret the journey that brought me back to them. Maybe I needed to lose everything to understand what was worth fighting for." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "They're lucky to have you now, the real you, not the version who was, always halfway out the door to the next meeting." "I'm the lucky one," Sarah replied. "I get to be their mother again. I get to witness the daily miracle of who they're becoming." As the evening wound down and bedtime rituals began, Sarah found herself once again in the familiar chair beside Emma's bed, Sophie already settled and drowsing with Mr. Peanuts tucked securely in her arms. "Tell the dragon story," Sophie requested sleepily. But Emma had a different idea. "Tell a new story. Mama, about what happens after happily ever after." Sarah smiled, understanding the request. Emma wanted to know what came next, how the princess maintained her happiness once the dramatic rescue was complete. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "there was a princess who had learned that the best treasures were the ones you shared with people you love. After she helped the dragons find their way home, she had to figure out how to live in this new world she'd created." "Was it hard?" Sophie asked, not quite asleep despite her closed eyes. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "The princess was used to grand adventures and dramatic gestures. She had to learn how to find magic in ordinary moments, in helping with homework, in cheering at games, in tucking little princesses into bed each night." "Did she miss the excitement?" Emma asked. Sarah looked at her daughter's earnest face, so serious and thoughtful even at bedtime. She thought she would, but then she realized that loving someone every day, being there for all the small moments that make up a life, that was the greatest adventure of all. Emma smiled, satisfied with this answer. "That's a good story, Mama." "It's the best story," Sarah agreed, "because it's true." As Sarah turned out the lights and whispered final goodnights, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from ending the day exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A conference call with Tokyo, Sophie's you, soccer practice, Emma's art class, the endless logistics of blended family life. But tonight she was simply a mother tucking her children into bed, preserving the quiet magic of ordinary moments, building a legacy measured in love rather than dollars. Sarah Mitchell had spent the first 40 years of her life accumulating wealth, power, and recognition. She planned to spend the rest of it accumulating memories, relationships, and the kind of success that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. She'd finally learned the difference between a career and a calling, between building an empire and building a home. And as she settled into her own bed in the house that had become the center of her universe, Sarah allowed herself one moment of pure gratitude for the airport encounter that had changed everything, for Sophie's fearless question and Emma's cautious hope, for Marcus's willingness to trust her with second chances, for the discovery that some mistakes could be redeemed, some bridges could be rebuilt, some hearts could heal. 6 years ago, Sarah Mitchell had been a billionaire who had everything and nothing. Today, she was simply a mother who had found her way home. The phone on her nightstand buzzed with an urgent email. Something about the Asian markets, probably requiring immediate attention. Sarah glanced at the notification, then smiled and turned the phone face down. Whatever it was could wait until morning. Her daughters were sleeping safely down the hall, and that was the only business that mattered now.